Welcome. It's great to have you here. We are going to be talking in just a couple of minutes with the great American historian Joanne Freeman, professor of history and American studies at Yale, who knows all about American political violence, but is watching much more than that right now, as we all are. What a time. And we've decided to make it cocktails because it's election eve and we're all losing our minds. So let me see if I can get the Joanne right in here. Yeah, let's just do it. Joanne Freeman in New Haven, Connecticut. Hey, at last.
Wait, this deserves a toast.
At last. I am so happy to see you.
Likewise. Likewise. I'm actually in New York City.
Oh, okay, great. Great. And here we are after all this waiting. Let me get I can hear you better with these in.
Okay.
After all this waiting, after all this time, after all this storm and throng, it's upon us.
It is. I don't know what the technology gods had against us last week, but I'm glad.
Can we start right here?
Yes.
It is the night before. I don't even know how to explain what this is the night before. We'll talk about it. But to courage, to our best hopes, skål.
Skål.
Oh, I'm there with you. Oh, I don't know what else to do on this night. That feels just right.
When we rescheduled it, it just seemed to me like having some cocktail in hand is the appropriate way to spend this evening. So
we are rolling with Joanne Freeman on that. Let's just start really personal. How have your nights been? Your middle of the night's been? Are you one of the insomniacs? Are you sleeping? Are you all right? Are you freaking out? You got the long view, longer than most of us.
I do have a long view, well, certainly as long
and
as.
And yet you're living day to day just like us.
Well, right. So throughout much of this administration, I said to people that I have a kind of split brain. So historian brain Freeman is saying, oh, this is very interesting. Like, look at the influence of technology and sort of chattering away about. Joanne Freeman brain is I don't want to say freaked out, but sort of very pent up, let's put it that way, and not sleeping a lot, I will say.
You and the rest of the country. Country.
I have to say that when I can't sleep and I make the mistake of picking up my phone and going on social media,
the doom scroll.
I say doom scroll, but even before I do that, I say here it is 3:30 in the morning and I'm not sleeping. And there are a lot of other people there at 3:30 in the morning who are having the same evening. So
does a historian study things closely enough? I mean, you wrote most recently, you wrote The Field of Blood, hardly a calming book title for us at this moment, but this was about the decades leading up to the American Civil War and violence in and around Congress. In Congress on Capitol Hill during that time, 70 instances of really sometimes shockingly severe violence at the heart of the nation's legislative body.
Right.
You must have read bazillions of diaries and everything else in that time. Does this remind you of that? Did they have this sense, oh my God, we're marching towards some doom scroll worthy event, in that case, the Civil War?
A newspaper scroll. No, actually. I mean, so here's what's interesting. And I talk about this a lot as a historian.
Yeah.
And it's going to sound obvious when I say it, but it's worth saying anyway. And that is contingency. The fact that people living through a moment don't know what's coming, right? And we are living through this evening in all of its glory. But the fact of the matter is, when I was writing my book and I was writing about people in the 1830s and 1840s and 1850s, they were getting, they were tense about what was happening. They were unsure about what was happening, but they certainly didn't assume that they were walking into a civil war. And as a matter of fact, a few years before what becomes the Civil War, members of Congress were saying to each other, let's all stay calm. Let's watch our language, which is very interesting to me. Watch the words you use, because if you use the wrong words, you're going to set off a violent dispute and everything's going to fall apart. And then we might end up going somewhere we don't want to go. So there was an assumption on many parts, including the fellow who's kind of the main character of my book. They could see the possibility of bad, but they never assumed that they were strolling into it, which of course, no one really can. I mean, I talk about this a lot when I talk about this moment. As a matter of fact, I've been talking about it on Thursday mornings. I have a webcast, a weekly webcast, 10 o'clock Thursday mornings, called History Matters, and So Does Coffee. And the first one was 7 months ago, which is shocking in and of itself. And what I talked about was contingency. And the reason why I thought it was important was, I think it's tempting in this kind of moment to say either it's all going to be okay because it's always been okay, because that's what happens in the United States, is always okay, which I don't think we can assume. Or you can assume we're all going to hell in a handbasket and it's all downhill from here and nothing we can do to save ourselves and we're done. And that's also not useful to assume. I think that we're in the middle at a point where what we do still matters a lot. And so I think the reason why it's important to remember contingency is because we are in a moment where we matter, and what we do matters, and what we think matters. And we don't know the outcome. And that's important because that can be an opportunity, among other things. That leaves an opening for positive change.
So when you say contingency, you mean what will happen? And we're talking right in front of us now, because what's already begun with all this voting, nearly 100 million votes already, incredible.
Right.
And the in-person voting tomorrow and the last of it. And then what happens on election night, these are right in front of us.
Right.
You're saying these things are all contingent on what we do, what somebody does, what Americans in total do.
Well, we don't.
Russians do.
Well, all of that, I suppose. Number one, we don't know, right? So if you ask me within the next hour, what do you predict is going to happen tomorrow? I will tell you, I don't know, because I don't think anyone really knows that for certain. But more than that, I think contingency, meaning nothing is decided, nothing is determined. And that's scary and that's empowering.
You have said that you sense the outlines of disaster in our moment. Now, that doesn't mean it has to happen, but it's, for Americans, this is a strange and unusual state of being, state of mind.
Right.
When we sense the outlines of disaster. It wasn't so long ago that we were supposed to be the great victorious way of the world.
Right.
The Berlin Wall came down, the Cold War ended, and we had the prize pony, and we're supposed to ride it off into the sunset. Of course, as a historian, you know it doesn't work like that. But it must not be that common in American history for Americans who are as attuned as yourself to be saying, I sense the outlines of disaster lying potentially right before us.
Right.
Why do you think we feel that in this moment? And when you look at that outline of disaster, which is not to say it's going to come to pass, but does it have form? What's it look like, oh great historian? Looking forward.
Putting the pressure on. What I can say is, so, you know, I can look back over the long haul of American history. I can say there have certainly been a number of moments that have been peak moments of crisis, and the Civil War is one, but there have been others. Moments of extreme polarization, moments when there's been violence, moments when Americans have been othering each other and saying that they are un-American, the other side is un-American, all kinds of moments that echo what we're going through now, but no two are the same. And the one that we're going through now has things about it that are distinctive. And one of the things that's distinctive about this moment is the ways in which institutions of government and the process of governance and the constitutional process itself are being hacked away at, so that certain things, which I think many of us, including historians, took for granted as, well, this is the way it operates, and we generally have a pact with each other as Americans that this is the way it's supposed to operate, that somehow or other it's not operating that way. And what does that mean? So you know, it's, what's interesting is I use Twitter a lot as a teaching tool. And so in public on Twitter, I'm spending a lot of time, and I have been for 3.5 years, talking about the Constitution and checks and balances and all of these things that I think we've taken for granted, including democracy. Meanwhile, privately, direct messaging, historians are talking to each other and saying, did you expect that to happen? Because I didn't expect that to happen. So as a historian, like many other historians, I can see patterns unfolding, and I can look at other times patterns like this have unfolded, and I can see many things that one would assume are true, like when rights get taken away, it's hard to get them back. Like, you know, democracy generally is fragile. Like, it doesn't take a lot for that form of government to fall. We just haven't seen it before. There's a string. I wrote a piece in the Atlantic a couple months ago talking about this. All of the ways in which, as a historian, you can say, you know, as a historian, I stand back and I see these patterns, and it makes me feel a bit Cassandra-like. Like, oh, well, in history, we've seen blah, 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 blah.
Empires rise and fall. Democracy comes and goes.
Right.
And goes more than it comes, and comes very rarely over the course of history.
Well, absolutely. And that's, in a way, the ultimate thing that we've been taking for granted, I think. And I think that's true of everyone, including historians and everyone else, political scientists, scholars, and everyone else. I think that we got used to the idea that democracy goes of itself, that our democracy, as you suggested a few moments ago, is powerful and strong. And as you put it, we are the prize pony, and we're the strongest and #1 in the show, and we are exceptional. And I think that assumption blinded many of us to seeing what was happening right in front of us. And I think that that has now been proven wrong, which is not to say that democracy can't survive, but it doesn't go of itself. Democracy requires work and diligence and alertness, and a lot of things we haven't been giving to it.
We're having election eve cocktails in 2020, which is a pretty amazing, wild time to be having them. To democracy.
To democracy.
With Joanne Freeman. Oh my God, long may it wave. But it may not. And for the first time in my life, I mean, maybe if you were alive in World War II, you had to think, what if we lose to fascists?
Right.
That would be, the fear was the extinguishing of democracy. But we didn't. And the victory was ultimately so resounding that this idea took hold. And you remind us in your work that at the beginning, there was a lot of fear that the American experiment would be short-lived, would be snuffed out, that would stumble and fall. But that seems so long ago now. We've had this idea, and we've said the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. You could drop democracy, and then we kind of felt the same thing, but it had gone on so powerfully with vigilance, schmigilance. I mean, we hardly even have civics classes anymore. We hardly even think about it. But what's your feeling as a historian about what has brought us to this moment where you have serious people talking about democracy, not just faltering and maybe failing in this country? I still can't accept that, don't begin to accept it, but people having that discussion on the eve of a presidential election is an entirely new experience to me. But if it falls here, then it could fall domino style around the world. Already you've got democracy receding in Eastern Europe. You've got, really, the pressure is on. You've got an American president who has not been supportive. In fact, who's been supportive of the strong men, who embodies something else. What's brought us to this moment? It's too big a question, but here we are. You've got the long view. What has brought us to this moment where the very thing that we're supposed to prize most is potentially at risk in this country, supposed to be the capital of democracy?
Well, this is going to sound like a simplified statement. I'm going to make it anyway because I think it's part of the answer.
Okay.
And I've been saying it in a variety of different venues in the last couple days. I think that above and beyond people assuming that everything's okay because we're the United States and we're always the best and democracy is safe, I think people have kind of forgotten what it means. I think I think that we're at a moment where there are a lot of isms and ocracies being thrown all over the place, right?
Yeah.
Socialism, communism, fascism, authoritarian. And I think democracy is being thrown around as though we all know what that is. And I don't think we all know what that is. I think that many people just kind of have a vague sense that that is somehow or other associated with liberty and freedom, and that's what it is. And I don't know if everyone has a sense of the rights, the rights that were fought for over many years by many different kinds of people, the fragility of those rights, how easy it is for those rights to be taken away and how hard it is to get them back. And that actually does go all the way back to the founding generation, they said things very much like that they were aware that the American experiment that they were putting in motion, it was a small r Republican government in a world of monarchies. It was grounded on public opinion to a degree that monarchies were not. It was experimental. There was no telling if it would work. And
it was the first in centuries, millennia.
Well, certainly in quite some time. Yeah. I mean, the Americans were looking back to ancient Greece and ancient Rome as far as their model. So yeah, they assumed it was experimental, and they understood and said all the time that the fragility, the vulnerability of a Republican form of government, of a democratic kind of government, is us, is the people. Because we, the people, by having choice, are able to be swayed and persuaded and fooled and cajoled and moved in paths that aren't good for the nation. So, you know, some of the people we now call founders or framers were not too keen on democracy because they thought the American public doesn't know what's good for it. This is dangerous, which is why they were always speaking about demagogues, right? The ultimate threat of a republic, of a democratic republic, to that entire generation. And if you look at the writings and the letters and the reports and other things of people in that period, what they talk about again and again is the threat of the demagogue, because a demagogue takes advantage of democratic governance to say whatever people want to get power. And then once that person gets power, he does whatever it is he wants to do. And that's how democratic forms of government, that's how republics fall. That was what ancient history taught. That was the lesson. So, you know, the founding generation is another world away, several worlds away from us. So you can't draw exact lines, but the idea that democratic government is vulnerable to people who appeal to the public and lie to them to get power, that's a lesson that has a certain kind of a human reality to it.
Is there any question that Donald Trump is a demagogue by the definition that they would have wielded at that time as they were founding the nation?
Well, but in that time, for sure, you know, again, we're looking way back in time, but as they understood it, a demagogue is someone who panders to the public to get power. Alexander Hamilton said that a lot about Aaron Burr, and then a little bit about Thomas Jefferson. But in both cases, that's what he meant. People who would say whatever it takes to get power. And then once they were in power, they would do whatever they wanted to do to benefit off the power. Hamilton thought that Burr would do that, and he thought that Jefferson was a little above that. So he preferred Jefferson to Burr. But by their definition, you could say, yeah, that Donald Trump is a demagogue. I don't think today we use that word so much, and we have a lot of meaning attached to it. So it's hard to draw straight lines back to the past. But if a demagogue is a person who panders to the public to get power, in a way that does not line up with what that person actually believes.
I don't know what Donald Trump actually believes, but we all have witnessed how he behaves as head of state. Was there fear that a demagogue would take the country into chaos, into disunity, into dictatorship? What was the problem with the demagogue? Beyond the fact that he would pursue his own interests and put them above the public's, and that would lead to what was their fear? They thought about this deeply and long.
Well, two options: anarchy or tyranny. That was it. You have a demagogue, it either leads to anarchy or it leads to tyranny. And those are the two ways it's going to go. Either things go totally off the rails, or you end up with someone installing himself as a kind of a dictator or tyrant.
Is Donald Trump a dictator in the way that they would have thought about it?
I can't even answer that question. And that's a more, I want to say that's a more, that word has a lot of modern baggage attached to it that makes it hard to draw that kind of a straight line.
It gets a lot more usage in common parlance than demagogue these days, though demagogues had a pretty good run these last 4 years. But after all, it is the fear. I mean, it is exactly the fear that a second term, untrammeled by the need to be reelected, fearing what might lie at the end of that term in terms of the judgment of people, with the party, the Republican Party, that seems to be clinging to a shrinking base of support. Therefore, it has every incentive to be anti-democratic. We've seen a lot of voter suppression or attempts at it in this time out.
Right.
It seems like a recipe for less and less attention to democracy and more to the consolidation of power. Or you tell me, great historian, am I wrong?
No, I think that's, I mean, I think this election is, if people hadn't noticed it before now, they're noticing it now, right? It's revealing a lot. We're watching one side actively, aggressively try to keep people from voting in one way or another, however that they can do that. And they're often being foiled in that. But if you are running for the presidency, or if your party is running for power, and your response to that is to try and find ways so that American voices will matter less, that is not a vote of confidence in democracy. That's anti-democratic. That's a group of people saying, we know we will lose if the public all has a voice. So we will stop some of the public from having a voice so that we can maintain power. That's not democratic. That's, democracy is a contest. Democracy involves contests with unknown endings. The Constitution is a kind of pact between the people and each other and our leaders and us. It also revolves around negotiating and compromising and unknown outcomes. That's what a democratic government is that you fight for what you want and you come out of it probably with no one entirely satisfied, but something that most people can say, okay, this kind of falls within the bounds of what we think is reasonable. If you have a side that is just throwing all rules to the wind and is saying, well, we don't really care about rules or elections, what we care about is finding a way to maintain power, those are people who have put themselves out of bounds.
Wow, and we sit right on that boundary tonight. I mean, I see big parts of our executive that are over the boundary already, and we're having cocktails over it because it's just so damn intimidating. But also, there is a moment tomorrow when democracy can stand up. Americans can stand up and say, enough, enough, enough. What are you drinking, by the way?
I am drinking a Negroni.
Oh, excellent. And I've just decided to go straight for the whiskey. After all, it's election eve 2020. To our health and more.
And to our republic's health.
Our republic's health. We'll take your questions, and they're coming in online here, and I'm very happy for that. Eric is asking, let's get straight to it because it's your field, especially American political violence, and in particular, the violence leading up to the Civil War. He asks, are we headed for civil war? Giant question. Here's the historian.
Right. So people have been, press outlets have been asking me that question for years, right? I mean,
before Trump?
No, at the beginning of Trump, at the very beginning of Trump, when there was just a lot of anxiety and anger. And a BBC reporter said, we are heading towards civil war, right? Right now it's civil war without the guns. I said, well, no, it is not civil war without the guns. And so
we got the guns. We got the guns all over the place.
It's true.
So
we always have the
USA.
guns.
We always have the guns. So
we always have
the part.
But here's the thing. So if by civil war, you mean the entire nation torn in two, no. If by civil war, you mean Americans turning on each other in some ways and violence, I don't know. I think my belief, and I think this is true, is that most Americans are not there. Is that most Americans are in a more moderate middle ground, don't want to see something like that happen. I think there are extremists who probably in one way or another are willing for things to go there. I think they're loud, and I think they're performative, and I think that they don't represent the majority of Americans. And I think it's hard to remember that when you're seeing things that feel so out of character for the contemporary United States.
I mean, the Civil War came when part of the country formed a confederacy and looked to secede. It had boundaries, it had turf, it had more than militias, ultimately its own army.
It was part of the country leaving and making their own country, right? So the country, you could draw a line down the middle of the nation, and
we did.
Generally speaking, free and slave. That was a different issue, a different time. I feel like people saying, are we going into a civil war, is a shorthand for people to say, will there be violence of American against American? If that's what people mean, I don't know. Right now there's a lot of blustering and parading around. I don't know. I don't know if there will be or won't be. I'm not going to predict that. I don't want to give credence to that. So, you know, like everyone else.
What were you thinking as you saw the long sort of ISIS-looking train of pickup trucks with fluttering flags try to drive the Biden-Harris bus off the road or something like that in Texas?
Well, so what I thought the short answer for that is bluster and intimidation and threats. The slightly longer answer is, so the last book that I wrote, The Field of Blood, talks, among other things, about how the Southern slaveholders in Congress protected their slave regime with threats and intimidation and occasionally violence. So
Southern honor as the first line of defense. If you offended them with your words, as you were saying before, you could be challenged, you could be challenged to a duel, you could be beaten, and it happened on the floor of Congress.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the thing about bullying and threats is that you only need to be violent once or twice for people to believe that a threat has power. So if a couple slaveholders were aggressive and you know, caned someone on the floor or pulled a knife on someone on the floor, people would take future intimidation by Southerners seriously, whether or not they went through with what they were saying. And that's the power of bullying and threats and intimidation. So what did I think when I saw the parade of people, you know, with the bus? What I thought was bullying and intimidation by people who are afraid of losing power and are trying to bluster their way into keeping it.
Kim is asking here if you can talk more about the patterns now and then. Patterns of behavior, patterns of thinking, patterns of division. You've said you see America in a kind of full-blown identity crisis now. Was that the case in the lead up to the Civil War? What are the patterns that emerged in that glide path to all-out worst war ever for this country? And do you see replications in small part or in large part now, or echoes?
Well, I think the short answer is there are some echoes, and they even go beyond the Civil War. So no one ever looks back this far, but of course, this is the real period I study, which is the late 18th and early 19th century. So in the late 1790s, so the first decade of the government, the big issue that people were really debating in one way or another was how democratic, small d, was this new government going to be? And one side, the Federalists, were less comfortable with democracy, and the other side, the Jeffersonian Republicans, were more comfortable.
So Alexander Hamilton was in that Federalist camp.
Correct.
Saying, don't spread the power too widely. People will go nuts and do crazy things.
People should vote people into office. They have the power to put people in office, and then they should basically be quiet and step out of the way. And if they don't like us, they can come forward in the next election and change us. Not comfortable with protest and many things that we now or should be able to take for granted. So that was a fraught time, the last few years of the 1790s. People began to fear that each side assumed the other was not American, was trying to turn the United States into something it was never intended to be, began to throw false charges out. The Federalists claimed, among other things, that if Jefferson became president, he would take away religion and God. Federalists told people to bury their Bibles so that Jefferson couldn't come and take them away.
It's crazy how Trump is basically saying the same stuff right now, over and over. Yeah,
absolutely. I don't think I haven't tweeted 1799 things all over the place. But the idea was they're not American. They're doing something horrible and evil, and they're others, and they must be defeated. You also had conspiracy theories come about, right? Because things were spinning out of control. So people were coming up with these strange conspiracies about what each side was really doing. You had extreme polarization. You had the press kind of spiraling and fueling a lot of these conspiracy theories and stories.
And you're still talking the earliest days of the Republic.
I'm talking
let alone when we get to the Civil War.
Exactly. The first decade, 1798, 1799, 1800. By the time the election of 1800 came about, there were people really not sure if that election would be decided. There were people in two states that were stockpiling arms in case there needed to be action taken to take the government into its rightful place. If the Federalists did something to stop the election, there were Republicans saying, well, then we'll be armed and ready to take the government back. when I researched that for my first book, Affairs of Honor, and I began looking at all of the letters and newspapers and diaries, what I saw again and again and again were two phrases: anarchy and civil war. They talked about civil war all the time. Civil war, it's civil war. So that's 1799, 1800. What happened there is, ultimately, I mean, there's a tied election. It gets thrown into the House. They have to vote 36 times to come up and resolve the tie. You end up with Jefferson president and Aaron Burr vice president, and people actually step back and allow, you know, an election is a decisive process, and people step back and say, okay, there's been an election, and now let's see what's going to happen. So the process kicks in. So now you beam ahead in time to the lead up to the Civil War. And again, you have conspiracy theories, and each side accusing the other of not being American, and each side thinking that the other is somehow destroying America, and extreme polarization and extreme othering, and national institutions being chipped away. A lot of things that echo with the current moment. Now, in that case, you didn't have the political system kicked in. You had a group of people secede from the Union and actually stand up and leave Congress. And it's a remarkable scene. When you read about it, there's a moment when Southerners stand up in Congress and say,
Southern congressmen and senators,
we have instructions that we have seceded from the Union, and they stand up and they walk out. So people in the galleries watched the Union dissolve in Congress, which is incredibly powerful, kind of stunning moment to think about. So beam ahead, let's go to the 1960s.
Okay.
Let's go to the Civil Rights era, right? So the Civil War was about slavery. The first moment I talked about was about democracy. Civil Rights area, we're talking, the 1960s, we're talking about civil rights.
Hold on for the 60s. It's time for another drink.
Definitely another.
It's election eve cocktails, by the way. Kim says here, we've been toasting the Republic with every drink since 2016. It's an act of hope. We toast it while we've still got it.
Yes.
To the Republic.
Cheers.
1960s, and again, we've got all kinds of division, people in the streets.
Violence.
And I was very young then, but I don't remember people saying Civil War.
No, well, I don't remember people saying Civil War. Now, granted, I wasn't around, but as a historian, I don't recall people saying Civil War. But what there was physical violence in the streets, and people could see it on TV.
Yeah.
Right. And so they could see this kind of violence happening in the streets, and it led them to think. So no, I don't think every time there's this kind of extreme polarization and clashing views of America that everyone always says Civil War. But as I said before, I think every one of these moments has similarities, but no two are identical. And we're having another one now. And in a sense, you could say it's about race and citizenship in one way or another. Once again, really big issues that people understand are fundamentally about what the United States is, that are making this moment what it is. What's
the identity crisis, full-blown identity crisis you've written that we're in the middle of right now? And an identity crisis for a country is an extremely fraught thing if its identity as a democracy is at stake, as a republic is at stake, if it's not able to accept who it is, if it wants to limit its definition of who it is to only part of the population. How do you see the identity crisis full-blown that we're in now?
Well, I think this is something that predates the last 3.5 years.
Yeah.
I think we've seen actually political parties kind of chipping away and becoming, although we're very polarized, the parties themselves increasingly are not so centered around ideas and more centered around feelings, and are more generally defined.
So what's the identity crisis there? Losing our sense of a nation of ideas and ideals and principles, and rather becoming just a nation of faction?
Well, so I'm on my way to that. I think that between national institutions and parties kind of breaking down, and the process itself not functioning even before this administration.
Parties, you're saying? Is it parties? Is it everybody, or is it the Republicans who are taking that path?
Well, I think parties generally are splintering. I mean, Republicans are taking a path that is very much anti-rule, right? They're sort of spinning off.
Yeah.
But the Democrats too are splintering into different factions. That's a different issue. But the point that I'm on my way towards is I don't think people have a firm sense of the we that we are right now. I just don't think people have it. I think at some points in the past, you could look to Congress and feel like a we was being fought for in some way, even though there would be very clear differences of opinion in politics. I think you could have a sense that people shared certain ideals. And right now, I think we still do, but I think there's been so much bluster and smoke about what people stand for or don't stand for, or what counts as American or doesn't count as American. And I do think that's largely coming from one side, that it's becoming very hard to see who the we is. And if we're not sure who the we is, you know, and we're not sure if one side is being very selective about who's included and the other side doesn't quite know what to do with that selectivity, that's a very hard way to reason your way into understanding who we are as a nation. So I think we're at a moment where we're being challenged on that front. We should be, depending on what comes next, really seriously thinking about this, about who we are as a nation and the way in which we can be inclusive about all Americans. You know, how we can create a we in a political sense and a we in an ideological sense. Again,
I guess I was born in the middle of the 20th century, which was the age of the royal we, which was still pretty white. And we was strongly felt, though, because we'd come through these great world wars. We had come through the New Deal, which spread the arms of the we much wider. We hadn't, in my earliest days, gone over the racial bridge yet, and we still haven't entirely by any means.
right.
But the we was extremely strong in the mainstream public discourse in those days. I mean, it was just, people didn't doubt it, they didn't question it. For an awful lot of people. Now, if you were the Rosenbergs, if you were caught up in Joe McCarthy's net, the we wasn't so obvious. But for an awful lot of people, it was so strong. I have trouble walking away from it, even though I've had to go into my own internal clockwork and reset it to get more serious, even more serious about race and sexuality and all the rest over these decades. But I still, at this moment, I wonder, and you're the historian of this period, does our original sin of slavery still haunt us because the initial we was not an inclusive we, because the initial we was essentially white men? Is that still, the problem on our shoulder?
Well, yes, in a sense that racism in one way or another has been ingrained in the American nation from the beginning. And rather than think about it, reckon with it, embrace the fact that it exists, seriously confront it, think about the ways in which it has and continues to shape American society, more often than not, people, not everyone, but some people deny it, right? We're not going to teach it. We're going to pretend that it didn't exist, right? America's a great nation. Let's not teach that stuff.
Well, I mean, it's pretty widely taught, but yes, and the president putting out his, whatever it is, American greatness history.
Well, that's what I'm talking about. There is no way to advance to a better place with race if you deny the roots of where we are now. And that's precisely what that sort of thing does. So yeah, I think we're at a moment when there are more white people than probably there have been in the past who are at least aware of real structural problems that need to be addressed. But, we have some serious reckoning and conversations to be had. We really have to think about this so that it's not a white semi-elite we, so that our we is inclusive, so that our we represents how we like to think about ourselves, but maybe haven't actually gotten down on the ground and come to grips with.
A drink for Election Eve cocktail, and let's go deeper on that one, because I think that's where the root still lies. I think there's a lot of other issues. Whiskey Straight with Joanne Freeman, who brings us all the history. Look, what is it? 46% of Americans who have continued to support Donald Trump. And we saw the vote from last time, overwhelmingly white Americans elected this president. Now, I, perhaps naively, and I've said it many times, but I came into this century thinking this would be the greatest American century because our country would increasingly look like the whole world, and in that would prove that our ideals, our values, our structure, our constitution really was or could be race-free. It could be applied to a population that looked like the whole world. And that seemed to me like a recipe for great success in a time of globalization. Now I don't know if globalization is going to go forward, and you've got a big chunk of the country, and a lot of it is white, that appears to be digging in its heels against accepting the demographic future that's already baked in. That seems to me to resonate with the fear and refusal of the Confederacy in the 1850s.
Well, and
They just wouldn't go down that road, and they would go to arms, and they would go to bloodshed, and they would sacrifice ultimately an awful lot, and in defeat, to say no to that. We just won't do it. I mean, how long can you keep a racial core of opposition to a demographic future that's already kind of in our laps?
Right. Well, I think back to the election of Obama as president, and the number of people that were willing to step forward and say, well, good, we're kind of getting past racism.
It was a hope. It was a hope.
It was, that was, I felt like that was a proud moment. I was proud to be around for that moment. And I was proud to have voted for that president.
Absolutely.
And I was proud of my country for having done that. But the idea that one achievement like that has resolved the race problem, there's so much, we have to have some serious conversations. We have to reckon with this. We can't, if you're still thinking that somehow if we don't talk about it, it'll be okay.
No, but I don't mean that. I mean, do you sense, because you studied the run-up to the Civil War, do you sense a core of white Americans who just won't go peacefully into the future that is already laid before us?
Well, but that future is a different future, right? So even Northerners who didn't like slavery didn't all dislike slavery because it was racist and bad for African Americans. Some of them didn't like slavery because they wanted free labor to spread across the West, and they didn't want enslaved labor to go that way. Some of them, there were all kinds of reasons why people became anti-slavery, and not all of them were sort of happy, shining, positive
about humanity, right?
About humanity or race or anything else for that matter. So people were, a lot of people had their heels dug in and were not rethinking things. And if they ultimately ended up supporting the North and fighting against the South, some of that, it was about slavery, but slavery represented a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And you kind of have to understand that anti-slavery people were not all anti-racist people.
Of course. No, absolutely. We understand that. The North had plenty of racism of its own. Abraham Lincoln grew up with plenty of racist ideas and, came around for the unity of the country and more. But I guess because you've read so deeply in there and you see this support that stayed for Trump. Now, there are other things going on there. There's we've got economic inequality that's through the roof. There's resentment about that, a kind of an entrenched elite that I think began to feel like it really didn't have to bother about those who weren't doing so great. Somehow this would all go forward. Adam Smith would take care of it, and withdrew. Didn't even exercise a kind of noblesse oblige or, stand up for the whole. It just, went off to their country houses and the rest and kind of checked out on the civic life of this country. But still, here's a group of people and have found champions in the White House now, Stephen Miller and the rest, who are willing to go to extremes, breaking up families and all the rest, to stop what's described as a tide of other, of brown, of you name it. Last time, in the Civil War, that got pretty crazy. Eleanor writes here, do you see a parallel here to the 1856 election? Is the modern Republican Party splintering like the old Whig Party?
I do think parties are splintering. I mean, the Republican
Parties,
Party.
you always go to parties. Is it really all the parties splintering? I mean, maybe the Democrats
No.
will. Maybe Joe Biden will go in and go full on, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez here. I don't know. Or maybe he'll
Well, that's what
revive
I'm saying. What I'm saying is we are not in a moment where there's any straight lines of alliance, right? You can say you're a Democrat and people can say, well, you're a leftist or you're a progressive or you're a moderate or you're and so different people are not, in a sense, even included, even by the left, as somehow being on the same side. So let's say that something good happens tomorrow and we emerge from this election. I'm not going to even go, I don't want to jinx anything, but let's say we emerge from the election and there's a moment when the Democratic Party can say, okay, let's get our feet on the ground and let's try and move forward and improve things. Do you really think that there's a coherent, unified Democratic Party that exists right now?
Well, of course, there's a lot to be worked out, but that's a debate. How much social services to offer, what to do about it. That's a debate that we have more familiarity with. Now, I think it's time to do something about inequality. It's gone just crazy, but that's a debate we understand. That's different from saying, let's blow up all the guardrails that have kept American democracy upright and moving forward, slowly in fits and starts.
Yeah, I totally agree. But I don't think the Democratic conversation is the same as it's always been, precisely because of what we were just saying.
Mm-hmm.
You can't say, well, we're going back to social services, and race is here now.
Okay, yeah.
In a totally different way.
Yeah.
And I think that has to be reckoned with and put into the equation with everything else. And I just don't think we've really done that before. And I don't know what that looks like now, but I think that's part of what we're living through right now, is an argument about that. Who counts as an American? To what degree does race define America? Is it literally just white?
Well, it can't be, but
no,
but the future.
But there are some people, right? There are some people who are acting as though that is what it is, and so we are at that moment. And the people who believe that are scared and resistant and angry and feeling that they're entitled to something that's being taken away. I was talking to someone recently and I was saying that some election moments are really about ideals. This election is about emotion more than anything else. And there's a lot of hate on one side. And if you look at the campaigns right now with the Republican side really yelling a lot about hate, and then Biden talking all the time about empathy. Unity,
empathy. There are people who don't want to see Donald Trump reelected, who I think have come to the point of hating. We got to acknowledge that. But the Biden message is certainly very different when he talks empathy and unity.
Both messages are so fundamentally sort of emotional and human, opposed to ideological. It's a really fascinating thing to me that we're not really talking about anything other than what kind of America do we want? Like that not even on a sophisticated level. We started out with like, whoa, healthcare. We're not even there anymore.
Yeah.
Like, what kind of nation do we want to live in a general guttural sense? And I think that's kind of where we are right now.
Liz asks, could you see geographic battle lines reemerging? It sounds crazy on the face of it, but you've got a lot of militia in Idaho. You've got, the New York Times is running maps of where the militia are, where they're the most active. I can't imagine something like a Mason-Dixon line.
Right.
But you've got the president talking about cutting out cities as anarchist zones, the Democratic-led cities. I don't know, pockets. If Donald Trump comes out tomorrow night, he's set this up, saying that if he's ahead on election night and he's not declared president, it's a fraud. It's a fraud no matter what, in his description. But if he comes out and calls all that out, not stand back and stand by, but just let's go. And it doesn't have to be said that clearly. Look, we've already got the FBI telling us we've had kidnapping plots and all the rest. I don't know, pockets, zones. Does that sound wacko to you as a Civil War historian?
I don't think that there will be clear geographically defined pockets in that sense of, I think that that we will probably, if there is a period of resistance in some way, violent or otherwise, there's going to be areas where it's more likely to be than others, but I don't think there's a civil war like dividing line. I think this is more scattered and scattershot than that. I think, as I said, it feels really big right now because it's just not supposed to be part of our political rhetoric and dialogue. It's not the way we're supposed to operate in this blatant and blunt and overt a manner. You know, I'm sitting here pontificating, but the fact of the matter is, where we started out was none of us knows really where we're going. You know, I mean, we have a sense of what's probably going to happen. We don't know what'll happen if that happens. You know, we're in a moment, I refer to it when I write as a moment of extreme contingency. We really don't know. And as I said at the outset, what that means is we have to be alert and aware to what's happening around us. We should not fall for all of the BS that's going to be thrown at us. And we should remember that we have the power to act and think and make change. More than anything else, I feel that Americans shouldn't simply sit back and say, oh, well, I guess this is where we are now, because I think that's tempting. I think that's part of the goal of throwing all of the stuff out at us, right? Like, let's overwhelm them with all of the bad, and then they're just going to shut up and sit down. And we shouldn't, and we don't have to.
Hell
and
no.
I don't think so. You know, watching all of the people voting in advance of the election day. So like everyone else, I had a mixed response to that. On the one hand, to see the people, you know, once again, I went on Twitter and I said, okay, here I am with my mask on, holding my absentee ballot.
Yep.
And I took a photograph of it so that I will forever remember the fact that I had to vote with a mask on and an absentee ballot. You guys send me in your images. And all these people had these images of themselves standing in front of polling places, holding their absentee, one after another, proud, kind of standing there. So my initial response to that was, look at that. Like, look at that. That's
Ain't
like,
that America?
Of course, we shouldn't need to be doing all of that, right? And we shouldn't be standing in line for 5 hours, and we shouldn't be. So that's the other side of this, is that in a functioning democracy, it's not that hard to vote. But both of those things are there at the same time. And the fact that there are people who are standing up and fighting and moving forward and presenting themselves, that matters a lot. And the more we can see that, the better that is.
James Carville says the election will be called by 10 o'clock tomorrow night for Joe Biden. Who knows? We'll see. You're right, though. We can't assume that all will be fine in the end. America's longstanding faith in its exceptionalism is blinding people to the fact that our constitutional order is fragile, that democracy requires hard work, and that success is not a given. Given all you've studied, if it looks like not, if it's not fine, if it's not successful, if we're going in the bad direction, what does that look like? What are the signs that we're going really off the rails?
I'm not going to make predictions like that. I just think,
I don't mean predictions, but so that we recognize it if it begins to happen.
How do I put this?
You could say it's already begun to happen.
Well,
that's what about stopping it.
That's what I was going to say, is that the walls are kind of closing in. The question is, what's going to happen between now and the inauguration, and who will be inaugurated? I think people can see all around them. We can see, what we were talking about before, that suddenly we're only allowed to learn about positive things, and nothing negative in America's past will be taught about. And certain people have rights and certain people don't have rights, and militarization and police sort of favoring some people. We can all see all of the ways in which scholars who study authoritarianism are pointing over and over and over again at things that are red flags.
Watch out.
Right. I guess what I would say is, and I know this is it's a cliche and it sounds kind of facile, and I don't mean it that way, but it's up to us. There could be all kinds of horrible things happening, but the fact of the matter is, we writ large are the country, and we have to stand up for it and what it represents. And
what does that mean after the vote tomorrow? Because a lot of people are thinking of this contingency. Maybe the country stands up and votes in a big way for Biden, but the country voted in a majority way for Hillary Clinton. Donald Trump won the Electoral College. Now it could be even more fraught and unclear what's happening.
right.
This gets way beyond your work as an historian, but we're all thinking about it. What does it mean to stand up if a fraud assertion is made by the President of the United States and he puts his presidential powers to work to assert in the courts and elsewhere, if it looks like it's not a just outcome that's proclaimed and acted on somehow, what do we do?
Yeah, we're way beyond my bailiwick as to what I do. What I do know is, the president declaring, like, I'm going to call the election tomorrow night. That's nice. It's not his power to do that.
Mm-hmm.
He could say whatever he wants. He always does.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't get to declare that. So the question is, how will the media outlets discuss this? What will they show or not show? What will happen surrounding that kind of a wacky sort of assertion? I don't know. And then assuming that whatever happens, the question is then, again, I don't have the answers to what we can do or should do. All I can say is all of the scholars of authoritarianism say over and over again, like Tim Snyder, what you don't do is surrender. From one of my colleagues at Yale, you don't surrender, step back, and give up at that moment. You don't.
Oh no.
I can't give you. I'm a historian who's like begins to, dip off in my expertise in the 1850s. So we're already way beyond what I normally do. What I can say is, there have been a handful of moments in American history that are this dangerous and this pivotal and this grounded in some really fundamental factors about what the United States is, has been, and can be. We are in that moment. We are in that moment together, and we need to be aware of what's happening around us and at least thinking about and acting together about whatever comes next. The other thing you can see over the long haul of American history is that the sort of protests and organizing that usually makes a difference, ground level, local. It's not some big national thing. It's people gathering together who know each other on the ground level and standing up for what they believe in. People have been saying that for the last couple of years, but I think, speaking broadly, I think that's true. So I don't have any answers as to what we all should do now. I mean, the fact
vote
that
if you haven't. That's above all the first thing.
Well, the vote. So voting, in a sense, is like the least you could do, right? As a citizen, you should do it. That's the least you can do, and you should certainly do it. Vote. And I know people have been yelling "vote, vote" for the last year and a half, but they're yelling it because it matters, and we are seeing a pretty remarkable level of participation before even tomorrow, which in my sort of alternating between being moved and being scared, but that falls onto the moved side. Look at that.
Yeah. Well, it is.
Yeah. I guess I am a historian of early America who wrote and has focused a lot on political conflict and political violence, and finds myself in the current moment more topical than I ever imagined I would be. I know that the United States has a long history of politics being violent. I know that America has a long history of just being a violent nation. That as long as we've been here, we've been that sort of a nation. All of that is true. All of that said, the fact of the matter is that it's being reckoned with and negotiated with and dealt with and shifted and changed over time. And there are ways to make it better, and there are ways to just step back and say, we're a violent nation, whatever. And I don't have the answer for what we do to move ahead into a better zone, but it sure isn't saying, oh, well, we're kind of racist, let's just keep going, which is kind of what we've done before. And I just think we're at a moment where there can be real change. And I don't know what that looks like. I can't tell you that, but there's the possibility, because things are so evident and because the danger and the fragility and the racism is so apparent. It's at the same time that it's a moment that's frightening and that we don't know what's going to happen. And I said this in the same piece you quoted before. What it means is that there's the possibility of positive change. In a moment when everything feels undecided, it's scary and you fear it might go badly. It can also mean some fundamental significant change. And so my hope is that the nation is what I really truly believe it to be, that there are enough people who love this country the way you do, the way I do, the way that I think most people do, who will do what they can to bring the country together and move us to a better place, and that that's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be instant, and it's going to take real work, and it might involve some ugly reckoning. But I think that it's possible for us to get to a better place if we're willing to do that work and not to step back and just assume that democratic governance goes by itself.
It's a catalytic moment. I don't feel much of anybody ready to be passive and supine in the days ahead. Tomorrow and the weeks that follow, I do not remember any moment with as much uncertainty at a fundamental level about what that would mean. You go back, you can look at the Cuban Missile Crisis. I can't really, but you could, and say, okay. But here we are where the whole thing is kind of on the line. I can't believe we'll let it go. I won't believe we'll let it go, but I've never seen it so real as a possibility. And here we are.
I think that's true. Earlier this evening, a colleague of mine, not at Yale, a historian colleague, sent me a private message and said something along the lines of, I hope you're doing well. I can't believe we're sitting here this evening wondering about the fate of the Republic.
And yet we are.
And here we are.
Election Eve cocktails with Joanne Freeman. We'll drink once more. I've just got the last of that whiskey. Down it goes.
I got a little bit of my Negroni there.
All right, we'll enjoy it on into the night. Joanne, we thank you enormously for doing this. This is tremendous fun, but it's fun, you know, dancing on the edge of a blade. And let us, whatever it is that each of us do, pray, yearn, hope, act.
Pray, yearn, hope, and act. Everyone out there, I'm sure many people have voted. Vote and be willing to step forward for what you believe in and to bring us together. I mean, like I said, I think most people love this country. They may love different things about it, but they do. And people have to remember that matters, and that what we do as Americans matters.
To the Republic.
To the Republic.
Thanks, Joanne.
Have a good night.
You too. Oh my God, let us have a good century, something like it.
That would be good.
Ciao. Thanks a lot.
Sure.
Bye.
Bye.
Do that. Thanks, listeners. It's great to have you with us. Thanks for all your questions and comments here. Joanne Freeman, Professor of History and American Studies at Yale. Vote. Get it out there. Be ready to stand up for what you believe. Peacefully. God help us.